Thanks so much for joining our session. Welcome to Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, the Science and Art of Integration. I'm going to save us about 10 minutes of airtime by referring it now to as SEED instead of Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. I'm Brooke Stafford-Brizard. I'm a director at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative on our education team, where I lead our whole child work. CZI is an organization founded by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, and we're dedicated to advancing human potential and promoting equal opportunity. And before we start our panel today, I just wanted to give you a sense of how our education team is approaching that mission and how it relates to today's topic. So, our education team is basically dedicated to significant outcomes for the majority of students through a whole child approach to personalization. And we take that approach with a few key understandings in mind. One is that broader set of, that student outcome is aligned to a broader definition of student success. And so it absolutely includes academic development, but it also includes skills and mindsets that we know students need for success in the classroom, in career, and in life. Whether we call those SEL, SEED, 21st century skills, we're committed to including them in our broader definition of success and how we define that outcome for students. We also know that successful personalization requires an understanding of students' comprehensive needs, inclusive of academic development, but beyond that as well. So you have to understand where a student's strengths and needs are, in math instruction perhaps, but you also have to understand physical, mental health, social emotional needs that drive their engagement and success in learning as well. And we want to do that through a personalized approach across all of those domains as well. We don't want to see phenomenal math instruction that's personalized and then turning to a student's health or social emotional development and see the same kind of one-size-fits-all, like direct instruction. We want to personalize against all these domains. We also understand that these domains are not disaggregated in the human child, so we want to make sure that we're thinking about our strategy through a holistic and integrated approach. One of the other kind of key understandings that we focus on with our work, which you'll hear a little more about today, is the fact that there have been decades of scientific discovery that help us understand better to serve the needs of children and adolescents in their development. Yet, as an education system, we have not kind of turned to those scientific discoveries and made the appropriate pivots or, frankly, 180-degree turns that we need to in our system. And so as we frame our education work at CZI, we're thinking about whole child development through the lens of human development. And I just wanted to give you a very high-level picture of how we're seeing that. So when we think about child and adolescent development, we're thinking about 6 domains. Academic is part of that. Oftentimes in the field we hear whole child, and it's kind of everything but academic development. It's inclusive in our model. We're also thinking about social emotional development, including self-regulation, sense of belonging, resilience, some things that you'll hear more about today. And we also tease apart cognitive development, which in the field can sometimes be synonymous with academic skills, but there are skills like working memory, cognitive flexibility when you shift your attention at the appropriate times, visual processing, short and long-term memory, that when we kind of create this false dichotomy of academic and social emotional learning, those cognitive skills oftentimes get dropped, so we're naming them very explicitly. We are also including a domain focused on identity development and how we think about personalizing an individual's sense of purpose, their values, their personal, collective, and cultural identity. We think of this as critical because more often than not, students are told what their sense of purpose is, and they're told what their identity is in school settings. And we round this framework out with a focus on physical health and mental health. Because, again, while schools aren't expected to address some of the physical health needs of students, that doesn't mean that it's not integrated in the student's life. So we want to name exactly what the students need with a perspective of comprehensive student development. A couple notes about this framework is we think of it as universal. This is a framework that is relevant to all human beings. We're thinking about it in terms of our pre-K through 12 strategy, but also how we're supporting teachers and leaders in the field in terms of their comprehensive needs and how we build their capacity to deliver on this type of experience for a child. And it's asset-based. So in the mental health domain, you don't see things like anxiety and depression. We're thinking about all the strengths that all individuals need to develop in the most healthy way possible. We are very focused in our strategy on integrated practice aligned to this framework. Not just because, like I said earlier, these skills are integrated in a student's development, but that to move toward a vision of scale with this vision in mind, we have to think about integrated practice because siloing these things out in different programs is not going to get us there. And we know that many of the skills that we'll be talking about today in terms of SEED are the skills that students need to engage in learning. So if they're not incorporated into academic instruction, we're missing an opportunity. And I just wanted to give a concrete example again of what we mean by integration with a construct that's been wildly popular in the last several years, growth mindset. So growth mindset is the perspective that we get smarter and we develop through effort. And it's counter to a fixed mindset, which is the perspective that you're just smart or you're not. And we've seen some very powerful interventions in the field that are kind of teaching students the difference between growth mindset and fixed mindset, the malleability of the brain, and we saw empirical evidence that those interventions worked. Over time, we saw that they weren't sustained because if you do not integrate growth mindset and that approach within a school beyond just that intervention, what we saw was if a teacher reverts back to a fixed mindset in her behaviors and in her language, and if smart kids are just celebrated across the school and growth and effort isn't, we don't see the impact that we want. So we have to move beyond just these discrete interventions to really think about integration in practice. So with that in mind, I want to kick off our panel. I'm going to introduce these incredible practitioners thinking about integration by name and title, and then ask them to introduce themselves by answering the question of whether or how they integrate SEED in their work and why it's critical to their success. And then we'll kick off with some other questions. So starting with Dale Urquiaga, who is the president and CEO of Communities in Schools. John Widmer, who is the senior director of school culture at the Kipp Foundation. We have Dr. Art Fields, who is the deputy chief of schools at the DCPS school system in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Pam Cantor, who is the president and CEO of Turnaround for Children. And so, Dale, if I could pose that question to you and ask you to kind of introduce yourself through that answer.
You bet. I'm happy to do so. Is this on now? Yep. So first, the point of privilege, let me just say what an honor it is for me to be here on this panel. And I want to recognize Dr. Cantor. She's one of the leading scientists in this field. With due respect to John and Art, it really is humbling for me to be here. And then if I add in John and Art, I will tell you that my friends at ExcelinEd have placed me here to lower the IQ average on the panel so that everyone could feel comfortable in the room. I have a tendency, my staff reminds me, I talk like an 8th grader, and so I'm going to tell a story in my normal 8th grade vocabulary to answer this question. This morning I visited a school here in Nashville. Communities in Schools is the nation's largest dropout prevention program through the provision of integrated student supports. Here in Nashville we have 6 schools. One of them that I visited this morning happens to be a Kipp school, so I've already told John this story is coming. I met 3 young learners at that school who exemplified how my program puts into practice social emotional learning and integrated student support and SEED work with kids. All three of these young learners, without using the words, identified self-management and self-concept. One young man told me, my mama put me here at this school, but this school was hard, and I would not have stayed. It was too rigorous. I would not have stayed, except my site coordinator gave me a mantra to say every day, I can, I will, watch me. Another little boy told me that he has behavior issues that resulted in attendance problems. He was expelled from a number of elementary schools. And the young lady also said she had behavioral issues. And again, her site coordinator, applying our model of a multi-tiered system of supports and interventions for kids, help them with life skills is the category that we use as a big bucket to capture SEED and SEL tactics and interventions. She helped these kids self-regulate and stay on track. All those kids are not leaving that school, and these are the children we want to stay in these schools. My program works almost exclusively with children in poverty, and because poverty tracks with race in this country, 83% of my children in communities and schools are children of color. And Communities in Schools is not a small organization. We serve 1.5 million children in 2,300 schools in about half the country. And we do that based on an original precept from our founder, Bill Milliken, who said 40 years ago, it's relationships, not programs, that change kids' lives. And so that's how we put SEED into practice. We provide case management, wraparound services. It might start with food and clothing and shoes, but inevitably it digs deeper into those underlying issues around attendance, behavior, and coursework preparation, and allows us to use Brooke's word, integrate into these children's lives, sort of the secrets that all of our kids got by the time they started in kindergarten. They got that by our presence in their lives. My kids don't all have that same presence at home. And they have so many barriers and structures that they don't have all of these skills that we're talking about here today. So Communities in Schools very simply works with our kids to ensure that their other issues related to their socioeconomic status, their zip code, or the color of their skin are addressed by arming them with these tools so that they persist. I'm proud to say 99% of the children who are case managed by CIS stay in school year to year. And our graduation rate is always in the high 90th percentile. Keep in mind, I serve a student population whose normal graduation rate without intervention is 50 to 70%. And so it's by incorporating SEED, this work of my friend Pam Cantor, and the gentlemen on this stage with me who are the leaders here, it's by incorporating that work that my program in the states and schools where we serve managed to keep kids on track.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the most exciting session after lunch. So we will be doing some chanting a little bit later. Dale is lowering the IQ, and I lower the professionalism. So to all of you without a coat jacket, touche.
Booyah!
All right. Thank you. I am super excited to be up here, and I wish I had heard Brooke's presentation 10 years ago, and maybe my story that I'm about to share would change. But at Kipp, I want to answer the question around critical to success and SEED integration in that order. So Kipp has historically defined success and driven by one of Brooke's boxes around academic development. And that is through academic performance in terms of state-mandated tests, and then high school graduation rates, college retention rates, and the to and through. That is still greatly important, but as Kipp starts to answer the question, are we setting students up to be successful in 2017, 2025, 2050, there's a long pause after that question. And so we start to think, are we really just shooting to the means to an end? Is that academic just a means to an end, and what would that end be? So I'm being just very transparent with you in the moment that Kipp is reflecting on, okay, so then the word success potentially means something greater around all of those 6 components leading to student agency and skills necessary to live self-sufficient and choice-filled lives that disrupt the status quo. So then the good news is, as we think about that definition of success for Kipp, and we think about where does social emotional learning and academics play in, It is very much an and statement. So we realize greatly that we need the presence of social emotional learning and academics to get to that end. Also, the good news is at Kipp, that has historically been the case. We have t-shirts at Kipp that say 51% character, 49% academics. I understand I'm using the word character, but it's just simply thesaurus for right now to social emotional learning. And so when you go into a Kipp school, there is a great deal of rigor that Dale speaks to, but there is also a great deal of student-facing programming, and I'll explain later in my next answer after my introduction why I'm specifying student-facing programming with integrated social-emotional learning. So that translates to print environment in our schools around the idea of social-emotional learning and character. That speaks to advisories or morning meetings or community meetings or trips or events or routines or systems like token economy systems of what we kind of incentivize our students for and how we recognize our students. So there is a great deal of knowledge in our schools and presence in our schools around social emotional learning, what those terms are, what are those skills, how do they translate to everyday actions that we want to see in our students, which is a great framework to build off of. But the key word is build off of, because we still are not yet setting our students up to be successful in the world of today. And I'll leave that cliffhanger there for my next answer. So thanks for having me.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm Art Fields. I currently work as the senior deputy chief, because my title was changed several times, for school culture. When we first started this work, we started realizing that we first needed to focus on climate in our buildings. And when I say that, I don't want people to think that we don't believe our leaders were focusing on it, but we decided that we needed to create something that intentionally forced people to focus on climate and then set a standard for what that would look like. We created a 3-phased model of what climate should look like in our building. The first phase being engagement, norms around building, how parents feel when they come in the building. Phase 2 was adult interactions, how adults are interacting with each other, how adults are interacting with students. Phase 3 was strictly focused on SEL. Even before we knew that we were going to form a seed office, we knew that it was important for us to start to think about having SEL curriculums in all of our buildings. But we decided to do this in an extremely measured way, which I appreciated. Because oftentimes as educators, whatever the new thing is, we tend to think, let's grab the manual and every school should start doing it tomorrow and do it really quick and we're going to see some outcomes. So what I've appreciated most about Chancellor Wilson, and he sends his regards because he was actually supposed to be here, and I joked with the panel and said, this is when everybody sneaks out because they thought, oh, I was going to see Chancellor Wilson and they sent this guy. But what I appreciated most about the Chancellor is that when he arrived, he said, we're going to first engage stakeholders and see what they think we should be doing. He spent time engaging up to 4,500 stakeholders, which included students, parents, educators, and community leaders, and just anybody else who wanted to respond to our survey, and we got approximately 4,500 responses. As a result of that, he decided to form the seed office, which is led by Deputy Chancellor Wanda LeGrand. Under that office, he then decided, he looked at our organizational structure and saw that we had offices doing a lot of things, but they weren't necessarily working together. So he decided to bring together the work of academic development, professional development, teacher development, curriculum, and because he heard from people that they wanted also some work around equity, he added equity in that work. So with all of that stressed the importance of the seed. And when I listened to the question about why is SEED important for my success, I'm really less concerned about my success. I'm really concerned about outcomes for our students. The way social emotional learning has traditionally been the other stuff, because we as practitioners believe that as long as you get high scores on tests and you're passing the park and all of that, you're a well-rounded student. What we're learning is our students are unhappy, they don't feel supported, and they're leaving our school with ACEs that were never addressed when they were in the building. So what I appreciate most about this work—
Can you clarify what ACEs are?
Okay, adverse childhood experiences. Thank you. Okay, that's what happens when you use all these acronyms all the time. Adverse childhood experience. So with that, having the opportunity to address those, as well as for me, I see SEED and I see SEL, I'm going to say, let's say SEL. I see SEL as a tier 1 intervention where everyone has access to it. And going back to what I was saying, when I think about success, I think about the success of the students. And ideally, if we do this work right, our students will leave happy, and then we should start to look at their post-secondary, do some surveys on them as it relates to their post-secondary outcomes and see if what we've done is actually work. Because for me, it's a lot, and I'll say me, meaning DC Public Schools, is a lot bigger than just getting you to commencement services. It's what type of adult you would actually become.
Thank you. The story that I want to talk about is, as much as anything, a story of my organization, but it's also my own story. Because Turnaround was founded on a core insight that has to do with, I think, partly my prior life as a child psychiatrist working with children who had known trauma. So a lot of what Turnaround does was shaped by looking at the effects of trauma and stress on children. And that insight around the importance of stress led us to have to build an integrated intervention, because you can't do just one thing in response to the effects of stress on children's lives. So I want to walk you through a little bit of the science behind this, but the science of stress and the science of human development is, as much as anything else, a validation of the work that my colleagues on this stage are doing, because we're all looking at what drives underperformance and what drives the development of whole children. So when you think about the impact of stress on children, the thought that I want you to take in is that adversity, even though it is part of the context of children's lives, adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. So literally, the events in children's lives can get under their skin, can set off the HPA system, the hypothalamic pituitary system, release cortisol, which is a hormone, and it's a hormone that has very direct effects on the developing brain. In particular, the limbic system of the developing brain. And that system has 3 structures: the prefrontal cortex, which governs attention and concentration, the hippocampus, learning and memory, and the amygdala, which is the place in our brains that remembers the stresses in our lives. So that system is exquisitely sensitive to stress, and that system is what governs the emotional development and cognitive development of children. So then it's not a surprise to us that children who are exposed to chronic, unbuffered stress are going to have effects on the learning center of the brain. We're not talking about acute stress, the kind that we all feel when we're preparing for a test or a recital. You know, we all have had that feeling and it goes away. But for the children we're speaking about, who often don't have the buffering of supports, this system goes into overdrive, and it can cause pretty significant issues in the development of these structures in the brain. So when you think about these structures and think about the skills that we're talking about, there are things like self-regulation, executive function, growth mindset that Brooke was talking about earlier. So the very skills that enable kids to engage successfully in learning. But here's the other side of that. Okay, the other side of that was also talked about by my colleagues, and I loved the sentence about programs don't heal children, but relationships do. So this is a principal in one of Turnaround's schools. And what's going on there is a principal is celebrating something that child accomplished. And they have a real, authentic developmental relationship. And what I mean by developmental is it's attuned, There is a synchrony between how that child is feeling and what the principal is doing, and it is authentic and trustful. And the great thing about relationship, and you all might or might not know this, it sets off another hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin actually opposes the effects of cortisol. So what I'm saying is that the power of the human relationship to prevent the effects of stress is the thing that we are underutilizing, not the folks on this stage, but something that we need to optimize in the ways that we work with kids. So the work that Turnaround has been doing has been to build an integrated environment, environments that are physically and emotionally safe, relationship-rich, trauma-informed, but most importantly, environments that intentionally build the skills that stress affects in children. And when you combine those kinds of environments with a rigorous academic environment, this is what I loved about what Brooke was talking about before, because it is about the whole child and the development of their skills and also the development of their academics. So today, we work intensively with schools in order to build out a set of tools to be able to promote this work. But in addition, we're beginning to share our learnings with leaders, with districts, with CMOs, and most recently with states.
Thank you.
I want to piggyback off of what Pam's talking about and ask Dale, because your focus is on relationships, and I know that requires intentionality and rigor, not just kind of going into a school and hanging out with the students, and that our teacher preparation programs don't necessarily prepare teachers through the lens of human development. How do you go about building adult capacity to ensure that all of the folks on your team are succeeding at the level that you do?
Yeah, thank you. So again, for context, Communities in Schools is about 2,300 schools in America. Each school has at least one site coordinator. If it's a large, comprehensive high school, we'll have 2, 3, 4. So figure there's 3,000 site coordinators just in my organization. There are folks who do this. So professional development is really important to us. This is not just hugging a kid. That's an important exemplar. But I had a superintendent tell me once when I began studying underperforming schools in Las Vegas, Dale, we can't love these children across the finish line. It takes lots of other supports, the academics and these interventions. So providing professional development for our staff is really critical. We've learned over the application of this model that an individual site coordinator has that role of being there, managing the services, brokering in needs, things to address student needs, but we also have in most affiliates a program staff, kind of a backbone that provide training around SEL, around SEED, and around developmental relationships. As Pam has said, and this is for my policymaker friends in the room, in 8th grade speak for me, not for you, there is science behind this. This is not loving a kid across the finish line. This is something that you should seek evidence for in the programs when you go home. Find interventions that are evidence-based. Find programs that use professional development to train professionals. I'm not asking you to put a cadre of folks in just to pat these kids on the head. They get enough of that. I'm asking you to find evidence-based programs. And so what we do is we subject our own model to independent evaluations. We use evidence in our training programs. Our program staff leverages that up. And we've now gone so far at CIS that we're partnering with Search Institute to develop an assessment, a measure of the developmental relationship. These are things we can measure. What kinds of a developmental relationship does a student have with a teacher? Does a student have at home? Does a student have with their site coordinator? So we'll begin using that tool in our schools by next year. It gives my team yet another tool. And we have a SEED assessment measuring, I think, 54 characteristics and domains around SEL. It gives me a pre and a post. And again, by next fall, that'll be deployed in all of my schools. But I'm not in all of your schools. And so, again, I would encourage you to seek those evidence-based solutions, seek organizations like those represented here at this conference, who will professionalize love, if you will allow me to use that phrase, in a way that gets kids the results that they deserve, as the secretary said during lunch.
And just to follow up, as we know there's a lot of work we need to do with measurement in the field,
Yep.
but when folks are going back to their states and their districts, what kind of metrics should they be looking at to ensure this is evidence-based?
Yep. So again, there's a science here. Pam has shown you great visuals for the things that go on inside a brain. I'm not asking you to measure their hormone levels, but tools like those that I've laid out, as I said, ours measures, it's a 54-item self-reporting survey that covers various competencies around social support, belongingness, social competence, empathy. These things can be measured. I'm not saying use this measure to grade schools. I'm not saying use this measure to evaluate teachers. I'm saying use these measures of these particular characteristics and then the developmental relationship. And that's my last request for policymakers. When you are not these folks and you do not have a high IQ, you go to Twitter for your answers. There's a joke there that I'm just not going to make. So I had my staff ask the Twitterverse what they would say if they were sitting here and they got asked that question, because I knew what she was going to ask me. And they said two things. So this is the other thing that I would ask you to think about when you go home. The comment I got back most was, look at your disciplinary policies. They're skewed the wrong way, folks. They punish the wrong kids for the wrong things. And the other was, put money in professional development. It is ludicrous to expect teachers who did not receive this training in their teacher prep program to suddenly be magical seed magicians. You cannot expect to have a CIS site coordinator in every school. There are 60,000 Title I schools in America. So I can't get there quick enough. So you should also go back and look for professional development money for your staff in these competencies, because again, folks have done this work. You can look it up.
Great. Art, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add a little something to what Dale said about the discipline. I think he hit it right on the nail. You definitely have to look at that. One of the first things we did recently in the DCPS, we just stopped even calling it discipline. It's just negative when you say discipline, so we changed it to behavior. In DCPS, and I should say District of Columbia, we have something called DCMR, which is a municipal regulation, Chapter 25, that governs how we do behavior in DC. But it's very legalese, so it's very subjective, and depending on what day somebody's having, Kid A might be treated very differently than Kid B. What I did with my office last year was we spent time actually taking all of the subjectivity out of it and saying this is exactly what happens to Kid A, and most of these were alternatives to suspension. These were things like Kid A and Kid B get in a fight, they go through restorative justice, and now they're going to do some community service together. Kid A happens to tag, as kids call it, right on the wall. We ask the parent, is it okay, with your permission, that the kids come in together and clean it up, write a paper about what this means to the school community, how you're affecting it, because we want kids to see the school as their home, and you wouldn't deface your home. So I just wanted to emphasize that importance of looking at alternatives to suspension. Last year in DCPS, we had a decrease of over 6,000 suspensions. But more importantly, we started looking at suspension days, because you can have 5 suspensions that take up more time than 25. So my focus right now for my team and my mandate of sort is that we always look at suspension days, and I ask the question to leaders quite often. If you could tell me the difference between 5 days out of the building versus 25, I'll approve it. No one's ever been able to answer that question for me. So we're going to always go with the least aggressive way of ensuring that our kids understand what happened. And most of that's through conversations, and it's all about the work that we're talking about here. It's the SE of the AD, So I just wanted to add that to it.
I want to come back to discipline in a bit, but Pam, I'd love to hear you shared kind of how the science informs the work that Turnaround does as an organization, but if you could elaborate on kind of what Dale and Art are referencing in terms of the evidence base that exists to support the really important need to integrate all of this in practice.
Sure. The thing that connects the work of each of us, oh, is it too soft? Okay. Okay, we can do that.
I don't think it was on. It's good.
Got it. Okay, sorry. One of the things that we have all been talking about are the skills that we would want every single child to be able to have to succeed in school and to succeed in work. And that in order to do that, we have to know something about which skills and how to develop them. So this has also a great deal to do with how we develop the adults. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you is a project that we did at Turnaround, and actually it was in collaboration with Brooke, and it led to the framework that you see on this slide, the Building Blocks for Learning framework. And what the project was about was to try to answer the question, is there a discernible pathway by which any child becomes an engaged and productive learner and person? And what are those skills? And if we knew what they were, would we be able to define a pathway in order to develop them in a school context? So if something is listed here as a skill, it means it's malleable. It's something that can be built. And there is a direct tie in the scientific literature to its impact on academic growth. But when you look at this and you look at the highlighted bottom 3 rows, this connects to what I was talking about earlier, because these are the skills that are most vulnerable to the effects of adversity. In addition to that, the literature supports that these skills are actually prerequisites for the higher order skills you see in the top 2 rows. And those skills are the skills that we want all children to have, and they are also critical for success in work and in life. So adversity puts you at 2 different disadvantages. One, you might have uneven development of these crucial foundational skills, and because they are prerequisites for the higher order skills, there are challenges to developing those. But when you look at this framework, and I've been asked this, the question of do you have to do each one of these things? And what I want to go back to is something that Brooke said before about integration. If you have an environment in a school that is physically and emotionally safe with strong relationships with kids, it will be a co-regulating environment for kids. It will support kids in the development of self-regulation skills. So I don't want you to come away with the impression that this is 25 tools that we somehow have to teach teachers and that they have to do them in some pattern. More importantly is what the concept of SEED is all about, which is a way to integrate this skill development so that when a child is learning math, science, or history, they are also learning executive function skills and growth mindset skills.
Thank you. John, can we turn to Kipp, which is a really self-aware organization focused on continuous improvement. And over the last decades, I'd love to hear how the approach to culture and SEED has evolved and kind of where you are as an organization now.
Thank you for that question, and I think Dale, Art, and Pamela set that up nicely, and so I'll reference the slide in a second. I think the benefit of where Kipp is in regards to SEED is Kipp's original identity. So when you go all the way back to Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin's middle school classroom, it was all about work hard and be nice, which happens to be our tagline. And I don't mean to be cute, but in the sense of really caring for the whole child. And that is at the essence of what Kipp is all about. I'm not saying that you walk into all of our buildings and you immediately feel that, but that's what our core is all about. So therefore, there's been a great deal of time, resources, and leadership autonomy built and permitted to really embrace social-emotional development. I think some of our lessons learned over the years speaks to exactly the building blocks up there. I referenced earlier, this is your answer to the cliffhanger that I know you've been so eagerly waiting to hear, is that I talked about student-facing programming was the way that Kipp has traditionally integrated social-emotional development. And so if you look at the slides, it's kind of like Kipp went up to the 4th row there and then just shoved a bunch of programs into our schools that taught those words: resiliency, agency, tenacity. And again, you could thesaurus it all day, right, in terms of self-control or et cetera. But, and really, and that's why when you look at our kind of like trajectory, the majority of students and adults knew a great deal about that role and about what character was, why it was important, and how it translated to academic performance. However, we skipped 3 really important rows. So I'm going to oversimplify the student experience for how, similar to Dale, mine might be like a 4th grade mentality here, but the student experience is really around those relationships, and those relationships function primarily between adult and student interactions on an every given day. And those interactions flow through a very simple kind of like flow chart. Staff mindset feeds how they think and believe what they believe, feed how they act, and how they act, similar to the disciplinary policies and et cetera, and the decisions they make and how they respond, impacts how a student thinks. And how a student thinks is that student's mindset, and then that student's mindset impacts how they act. And so when you look at the building blocks, that student actions are similar to the 4th and 5th row. Student mindsets is that 3rd row around growth mindset, self-efficacy, social belonging, et cetera. And then our job as adults to feed that. So from that framing, our lessons learned is that we have to stop focusing on the students and start doubling down on our staff. And so that is both content knowledge, kind of like building our own content knowledge and our consciousness of both the science that Pam's talking about, really understanding what toxic stress is and how does that play out. And so when that student makes a decision to get in a fight, it is not something they planned at 8:15 a.m. in the morning to mess your world up, right? It is an actual response to the kind of like environment, or to their experiences coming into the school that day and what was triggering around them. And then making sure that our adults understand that. That's the content knowledge. And then imposing, okay, not only is it their world that we need to understand, but also our own. So me walking into a building and my own experiences, the fact that I'm a white male means something before I even open my mouth when we serve predominantly students of color, and et cetera, all of those experiences. And so when I talk about staff mindsets, that's what we're talking about. And the good news is we have professionals and experts like those on the stage right now that really double down and help our schools currently kind of like learn that knowledge. So when we talk about integration for Kipp, it's really about going from those student-facing to really giving and equipping the adults to make sure that those everyday interaction, those hugs that we're talking about, are grounded in the science and in the right mindset.
Thank you. Art, I'm wondering if you could build on that in the sense of adult mindset and back to the survey that you mentioned. What did you hear from your teachers with the chancellor's engagement that made it very clear that SEED should be a priority in the district?
What we heard from our teachers was that they needed training, they needed supports, they needed some. So what we decided to do was this year, and first of all, let me say this. There were lots of schools in DCPS, approximately 50 out of 115 that were implementing an SEL curriculum. So I always like to give respect to those because they labored in the fields for years before we made this a central initiative. But knowing that, we still knew that we needed to norm around what SEL means for DCPS, what SEED means for DCPS. So we decided to take this entire year and every PD day that we have this year to at least spend some portion of that day focusing on SEL, and only for the adults. This wasn't information we wanted you to get and then run back and start implementing. This was forcing adults to have difficult conversation, deal with their own implicit bias, talk about what it would feel like to implement this in the classroom, and that's what's still going on. So even though we have some schools that are actually implementing, we didn't want to stop them and say, now we've decided to make this a central thing, calm down, do this. We are still spending taking the time to make sure that everyone is normed around what SEL is at DCPS. And part of that will result in us actually coming up with what SEL will mean for the District of Columbia. We started with the CASEL framework and their 5 competencies, but we know there are things we need to do to make it our own. One of our examples is adding and interweaving cultural identity throughout it, because that's extremely important. We don't believe you can be self-aware and not be culturally aware. So for us to continue focus on training as we continue to build the model for what it will look like in the District of Columbia.
And this is a question for all of you in relation to that. There is criticism in the field that SEED and SEL is kind of imposition of dominant culture on students. And so I'm curious about your perspective on that and how the science informs that.
You're the scientist.
Okay. If I understand the question that you're asking, the earlier history of SEL presumed that there was a set of skills that all kids needed, and therefore, whatever those skills were, they were going to be taught to all kids. And so there was a presumption that those were good skills, and that whatever the skills were that children already had were not seen as valued or authentic or culturally consistent with their own identities. And so I think that there was a problem with imposition of a norm onto kids. Second, there was this idea that SEL was for high poverty kids, as if the skills and mindsets that you see on this framework are not true of every successful person that you all know. So there was something in the narrative that we were repairing the poor kids toward a norm, and that this was not about human development and not about the kinds of habits, skills, and mindsets of all successful people. And I don't know whether it is a problem in narrative, but it's definitely not a problem in terms of what is scientifically true. This is true for all people and all children, and it actually should be the mission of schools to develop children, not to give content to children. And I think that is the biggest paradigm shift that we're calling for, and what I think is actually very brave and ambitious about what you're embarking on.
Thank you for taking that hardball, Pam.
I noticed the
Art, I want to, you mentioned with this survey and kind of listening to the stakeholders within your community, there was a lot of interest and support for a focus on SEED. I'd like to start with you, but I'd like anyone else to weigh in on how you address the criticism that focus on this will distract from academic rigor and what we already need to focus on with students in a school day.
I think a lot of that goes to what Dale said. You have to select evidence-based programs and be able to show the data behind them, and we've been sharing that out. When we made this decision, we also engaged organizations like Second Step, School Connect. We've been working with Castle. We're getting the right information so that when people ask us questions about it, we're able to give them research-based answers. Our parents are extremely smart, and they respond to research. But we also have to spend the time to take and understand and address their concerns. How are we balancing this so that it doesn't feel like, it's the example that one of my friends said recently when we were coming out of a meeting, friend/colleague. She said, I hope that SEL doesn't become icebreakers, the new icebreaker. So it's the importance of understanding the research behind it, and I'll never try to piggyback off what Dr. Cantor says because I just wouldn't do that. But she spoke about, I'm just not going to do that. That won't go well. But she spoke about a few minutes about the importance of the research behind it and all of that. So that's exactly what we've decided to do. We made a decision to do that.
Dale?
Yeah, and, go ahead. Okay, I'll add to that and I'll give you some backstory. I'm not an educator. I'm clearly not a scientist. I was a policy guy, and I worked for the governor of Nevada for a time, and I ultimately became the superintendent of public instruction there. And I was one of those high standards, rigor reformers. I have been a longtime supporter of this foundation and the work that ExcelinEd does. But I learned in that job by understanding the population who comprise schools in my home state, that I could have the best math test and English test, and that if kids were not arriving ready to learn, they would never pass my fabulous test. And I could hit them, figuratively, with the best standards over and over and over again, and I could evaluate their educators on those standards over and over and over again, but that things like poverty and race simply were barriers. I had to learn that. And I think that this is in that same vein. I think it is possible, if I can be taught, folks, any policymaker in America can be taught, that these skills, when we talk about SEL or we talk about SEED, we talk about these behavioral characteristics are the gateway to all learning. We cannot put the cart before the horse, as my father used to say, and say, well, here's the math test, and then wonder why they didn't pass the math test, and then figure out it's because they have no self-awareness, attachment, no self-management, or self-regulation skills. And that's kind of the box we've put ourselves in over many years of accountability and reform. And fortunately now, because of some frustration in the country on lots of sides, I think the pendulum has swung. But it is in our interest to do this from an evidence-based practice, to rely on the science, to train educators, and to be transparent with families so they know what's coming, and they know that these things are not a little bit of this over here, unrelated to a little bit of this over here. That for children in today's environment who come from these backgrounds in particular, these things are inextricably linked, and that we do them and their future a disservice if we somehow try to say you can't have one without the other.
You mind?
No?
I also think on top of the science, there's logic. I think, Brooke, it goes back to the question of like how we define success. If you're trying to engage an audience that questions actual seat time or classroom time around SEL. I think because if we are driving success through academic achievement and performance only, that's why we then have governor and the secretary saying that we are not setting up our kids for success, because that has been our historic North Star. And then B, we ask ourselves, are we actually, if that becomes our driver and we keep that time sacred and we kind of like shut out all of those boxes up on the slide, then are we really setting up our students up for success in the real world or outside? And so if I make it personal for me, the way that really resonates in terms of logic, in addition to science, is if someone came up to me, and I'm about to create a binary situation, so I apologize, and said, hey, your son, Gavin, my 10-year-old, who is clearly a genius, let's just be real. That's not true. And if he said, hey, he could go to Harvard, or he could live a life full of agency, choose now, right? And I know I'm being cute. There's no choice in that. There's no choice in that. And so I think it's important to remember what's our end game that we're actually driving towards.
So as we think about kind of the policy implications to everything that we're talking about today, I did say I wanted to come back to discipline and how critical it is within kind of the sphere of policy to think about where discipline policies actually contradict what we really understand of child and adolescent development. And so, Pam, I'm wondering if you could just reinforce what you shared already, but kind of explain what is happening to the escalated brain of a child or adolescent, and why exclusion and isolation is kind of counter to what they need to regulate, and why that co-regulation is so critical.
Yeah. So one of the things that is most antithetical to development for kids is the experience of shame and exclusion. And so I want you to just remember that, and then let's go back to some of the things that I was talking about before in the science. That children who are triggered are often children who don't necessarily have fully developed self-regulatory skills. So, as John said earlier, they didn't decide to do the thing that they did. Okay, it just happened. And so if you think about if this were your child, what you would want to do at that moment is you would want them to regulate themselves. You would want to help them de-escalate. And often, the most powerful way to de-escalate a child is through a human connection that gives that child another choice, a choice that would carry a new opportunity and a choice not to be shamed. So discipline policies that suspend kids, expel kids, call out kids in classrooms, all they do is remove kids from an educational environment and add to the shame that they feel for something that they couldn't control. The alternative is an adult that cares about them scaffolds a way for them to have a different choice, a second chance, and a success. So which would you choose? And this is something, I mean, we teach it to teachers, to our teachers. It's part of our professional development. These things are not hard to learn. But everything about the discipline policies that we have right now cut against what could set children onto a healthy developmental track.
And so we have states like Maryland and Ohio, I just spoke with someone, who are kind of taking those kind of innovative and bold steps to kind of remove policies that focus on isolation and exclusion. We also know that teachers aren't prepared through kind of traditional classroom management to do what Pam's talking about. So I'm curious from all of you, what are the kind of sister policies that we need to put into place to support the development of adults to actually make this happen at the system level, where we can remove isolation and exclusion, but make sure that our teachers and school leaders are prepared with the skills that they need to take this alternative approach.
Tell the story of how we got together. Can I do that? Yeah. Is that all right? I think there is actually a story in this, and John and I don't know each other that well personally, but our organizations are in a partnership now, so we're going to be getting to know each other very, very well. Kipp and Turnaround are working together in DC, and Brooke used the phrase self-aware to describe the Kipp organization, and that is really true. Because basically what was happening was that Kipp was suspending too many kids, and they were really upset about that because they were supposed to be an organization whose culture supported kids and didn't remove them from the classroom. And so they asked us to work with them and work with their teachers. And at this point, Turnaround has trained all of the Kipp teachers, but the training that they wanted was this ability to redirect students, give them opportunities to make a separate choice, and to be able to not be shamed and to develop their regulation skills. The reason I'm focusing on this story is this is the entire Kipp system in DC is now using a different set of practices and not removing children and isolating them. And this is a partnership that's about almost a year and a half old. It's not even that it's been going on for that long. So I wanted to highlight that a system could make a decision to do something a different way, and it would require the will and the professional development to develop the skills.
And if I could thank you, Pam, for sharing that. I think also, if I could elaborate on that, Brooke, you were talking about systems, and I think, Art, you might be able to speak to this better than I can, but, Kipp DC had to make deliberate staffing and scheduling and financial commitments to this partnership to take, full days of professional development among much other time to do this. And so this goes back to your, taking time out of the academic, right? There's many of other alternative topics that we could put in front of our teachers and our staff that drive academic results. But I'm sure Art can relate, as we both are in the world of school culture, is we can play the story out. If we don't provide the teachers with the skills necessary to both identify when a student is triggered and even before that, identify what they did to trigger that student, then it plays out pretty simply. That student then gets triggered. They go ahead and have kind of like a emotional response that's normally exaggerated. The staff member then does their whole like flight or fight, right? And then that blows up, and that's how we have suspensions. Please, leave. And then we think the suspensions teaches, that student comes back in, they lost their academic time, they now don't know what's going on in the classroom, and then since we didn't know what actually happened the first time, we do it again, right? And so what Pam's organization is doing so wonderfully for our teachers is equipping them, right? You go into the PD and you're like, what's this, how is this helping? We're talking about, the brain, what does this have to do with an actual math concept? But it's those moments when we're talking about that happen right before the hug that the teacher and the student have that actually increase academic time, because that teacher can, hopefully avoid the trigger, or at least quickly identify, de-regulate that student, get them back on, and then keep on, keeping that lesson going. So I like to always play out how it happens.
Dale, did you want to add something? Before you do, there's a microphone to my right, so I'd like to invite any folks who have questions to step up to that mic. And when you do ask a question, please share your name and organization. Dale, did you want to add, or?
Sure, that way we don't get any difficult questions from the audience if I vamp for the rest of our time.
Please feel free to go up in line. I didn't mean to.
Spent a lot of time in politics. I know how to do this. I just want to quickly say, while you're going through the professional development, I would be remiss if I didn't make a shameless plug for organizations like mine. Add a resource to the school. If a district makes a conscious decision, whether for purposes of equity, we are disproportionately disciplining children of color, or for purposes of chronic absenteeism, when we bounce them, guess what? They're not in school, and you will now be held accountable for chronic absenteeism. Whatever your motivation is, if a district or school makes that decision while you're looking for PD, adding a resource to the school helps. I was in one of your schools when I first took this job, Martin Luther King Elementary in Anacostia. Little boy, 5th grade, melted down on the stairwell while the principal was doing my tour, using language no 5th grader should use. And she very calmly redirected my site coordinator, who was doing my tour. She took this little boy, she turned to me and said, his grandmother died this weekend, his father is incarcerated, he's dealing with it in the only way he knows how, and on she went with her tour. It was the most calming, wonderful thing I've seen, but kudos to you. They are using those tools in that district, and I'm happy that they had a site coordinator there to help them. So part of this is make the commitment.
I just want to point out, when we talk about personalization, sometimes people turn right to technology and kids on laptops. What that principal did was personalization. Mm-hmm. Questions?
Well, thank you so much for such an inspiring panel. My name is Anna Wishart. I'm a senator from Nebraska. And I have been reading about schools that are replacing detention with yoga and mindfulness. As a freshman senator, I enrolled in yoga classes to manage stress. And
Stay enrolled, Senator.
And it was very transformative, learning how to manage my emotions and be mindful of them. Would love to hear more if any of your schools are doing that.
We actually have probably about 15 to 20 schools in DCPS that are actually using yoga. And recently, I just signed a contract with a yoga group to come provide it for our adults. So we are going to have yoga provided. Every person will get 10 sessions, but not only just 10 sessions in yoga, they're actually going to talk with them about some of their SEL competency, because you never graduate out of SEL. So they're going to spend time doing that. We're tying it to our 5 SEL competencies, and it's going to be 2 classes twice a week for 10 weeks. Up to 60 people can sign up, and it's totally free. The district is paying for it.
Can I join?
Yes.
I would share that Turnaround has incorporated mindfulness in our program as well, both for the stress management benefit and for the increase in children's self-regulation skills. But the science about the benefits of mindfulness around those 2 things, but actually there's even more provocative science about the neural integrative energy that mindfulness can provide to children. So I think that it's a very, very powerful intervention, and something that should be used much more broadly.
And I would just add, in terms of back to personalization, yoga is an incredibly powerful practice. I practice yoga, but we also want to acknowledge that some people run, some people cook, like contemplative practice should be what works for the individual. So we don't want to blanket schools with just yoga.
Sure.
Please.
Hi, Kara Morgan. I'm the State Board of Education in Ohio. And thank you, a wonderful session. And I guess my question is, we're working on a strategic plan, and we get it, we hear this, we want to include it. But just in this session, we were presented with two frameworks. There's the CASTLE framework, there's the language means different things to different people. So my question is, what advice do you have for us? Where can we go to get the definitions, to get the right buckets, to be able to have these conversations? Because I feel like that's a stumbling block that shouldn't be there, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Brooke, you want this one?
We're working on it at CCI. I think what we're trying to do is turn right back to the science and ensure that a space that perhaps has functioned with a little less discipline and rigor and grounding in conceptual frameworks moves there. All of the organizations and frameworks that you speak to have powerful contributions to that, but we are working on coherence and scientifically grounded framework. There are also researchers like Stephanie Jones at Harvard who's working on what she calls a taxonomy project, where she's trying to build that engine and that thesaurus that will help practitioners understand, when I see self-control, here's how it relates to self-management and self-regulation. So I know there are efforts in the field, and hopefully we can support kind of bringing that to scale and to folks who need it.
Can I say one thing too? One thing that might be comforting, if we were to look at a very high level at what you heard today, you heard that environments are important, that relationships are critical, and that intentionally developing the habits, skills, and mindsets of children is critical. If you decide as a state that you are going to focus on those four things, then you may pick the programs that you would decide to pick to plug into that. The thing that I would tell you that's really clear from the science is don't do just one of those things. Don't do just relationships or do just growth mindset, as Brooke's example. That's the real danger that we have, that children's brains are wired to learn and they need to be in integrated environments to support that learning. And so if you take the environment, relationship, skill, and mindset and plug in the things that you think are worthwhile, that would be a great start.
Hi, I'm Kimber Lytle. I work for the Senate Majority Leader in the Wisconsin State Legislature. Two questions for you. So one thing, as we meet with administrators and representatives of public schools, choice schools, et cetera, they all talk about the growing number of children who aren't able to self-regulate, which you've talked about, but it's not necessarily due to ACEs of trauma. Some of it is they're children of today's culture where everything is immediate, they are overscheduled. We have kindergartners who have a sport every single day after school, et cetera. And they talk about, the administrators talk about things they've implemented in their schools that the teachers are doing with the kids. One question I've asked them is, what do you recommend the parents to do? Because, I mean, parents love their kids. They want to do stuff to help so that their children can learn, the classroom is controlled, et cetera. And a lot of times they are struggling to figure out what recommendations to provide to parents. So I'm wondering, are there any evidence-based practices, recommendations out there? And does it vary depending upon, I guess, the reason that child is having challenges with self-regulation, trauma versus being overscheduled, never having to wait for anything, et cetera?
I cannot speak to the research, but I can speak as a parent of children that have the same story that you just described, and while trying to learn the work professionally at the same time. And the good news is everything that I just described in terms of the approach that we want our teachers to take is really not much different, at home. So, I'm not sure if someone else on this panel could speak to kind of like an off-the-shelf or a research-based program for parents. But in reality, what's helped me at home the most, and when we're talking about is the parent development of understanding, again, why my 10-year-old is responding to, bedtime the way he is, and why is it that when I respond with a raised voice, then that triggers him further. And so, what's helpful is, so I think, again, it goes back to that, the same way we want to give our teachers with the content knowledge and then the kind of skills necessary is no different for parents.
There, just quickly, Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson write some very powerful books on this for parents. No Drama, Discipline, and Whole Brain Child. I use them for my kids. I want to see if we can get through the other questions, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, my name is Alice Ginsberg, and I'm Director of Research for an organization called the Branch Alliance for Educational Diversity, for Educator Diversity, excuse me. And we work with minority-serving institutions like historically Black colleges, tribal colleges, Hispanic-serving institutions to enrich their teacher education programs. The reason why I bring this up is because minority-serving institutions already are built on a lot of these building blocks, like a sense of belonging, relevance of school, agency, civic engagement. And I think it's just really important if we're going to train our teachers to do these things, that it's modeled for them as they're becoming teachers and they learn that way and understand the importance of what it is to learn like this. And I'm just wondering if you had anything to say on that.
Amen.
Yes, thank you. I think you said it very well.
I'm Russell Hayward. I'm the Executive Director of the DC State Board of Education and also the President of the National Council for State Board of Education Executives. And I actually have two questions, but one was just asked, because we actually have some way over teacher prep programs, and it's something the State Board wants to be more active in, especially in terms of equity and child-informed teaching. The second question I had is, in the district, we have two offices that are located within the State Board, the Ombudsman for Public Education and the Office of the Student Advocate. And I was wondering if you guys have any experiences with those offices specifically. And just for quickly, the Ombudsman provides direct student services and due process support for parents in all of our schools, both public and public charter. And the Office of the Student Advocate provides a lot of parent support in learning the systems, because in the district, it's just like everywhere else, it's a very complicated system. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on those offices.
So I know Johanna very well, the Ombudsman. I actually think that it's a service that parents deserve and need. I mean, it's as simple as that for me. I think they can give voice to parents' complaint, parents' concerns, and I have a great relationship with the Ombudsman and respect the position.
With that, we're able to end on time and want to thank you for joining us today and thank all of our esteemed panelists.